Hello, everyone. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is our podcast. For the next many months, we'll be highlighting great conversations from our decade-plus archive. We're planning a new iteration of this podcast, and as a result, we're going to take a while to figure out what that might sound like. Until then, we hope you enjoy these trips down memory lane. George Saunders is one of America's most well-known short story writers. He has a new collection titled Liberation Day. Of that book, our reviewer, Colin Barrett, writes that it's a spiky, at times difficult collection. But, he continues, these are stories worth reading, the best of them as thought-provoking and resonant as a fan of Saunders might expect. In February 2017, he spoke with Pamela Paul upon the publication of his novel Lincoln in the Bardo, which later won the Booker Prize.
George Saunders joins us now. George, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for asking me, Pamela.
I think the first question on most people's minds when they hear the title of this novel is, I think, hopefully not who is Lincoln, but what is the Bardo? What is the Bardo?
Yeah, well, the Bardo is technically it's a Tibetan word that just means transitional space or transitional zone. So technically we're in one right now. We're in the Bardo between birth and death.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that the title refers to is the one that happens between the moment of your death and then whatever happens next, which is in the Tibetan tradition would be your reincarnation. So it's kind of a purgatorial state, except that in my understanding of it and my kind of reconception of it, it's a little bit more transactional. A person can sort of progress their way out of the Bardo just by realizing what they are and why they might still be stuck there. And then the second sense is that Lincoln himself during this period, he's kind of in a transition too, which is, thinking, I suppose, it's going to be a quick war. He's going to be a heroic figure. It's going to be easy. And he's just lost his child. His son has died. And now he's also at the same time seeing that this war is not going to be any kind of easy thing. And it's going to go on for a long time and cost a lot of lives.
So to get back to the Bardo, before we talk about the rest of the Lincoln part of it, there's a bit of the sort of personal willpower as opposed to the idea of purgatory, where it's sort of not
right, and maybe even kind of like understanding, of yourself and who you are and why you're there.
So I have to ask, are you a Tibetan Buddhist? Did you?
Yes, and I'm a kind of an amateur one, so I quickly realized that I couldn't really, I wasn't qualified to write a book about the Bardo, which kept strictly to what the texts say it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of used that word, I guess, a little bit as a trigger to myself to make sure that this afterlife stayed weird.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing I was afraid of is that you'd have an afterlife that was too recognizably the one that we all think it is. So I kept saying to myself, if I drop dead while I'm writing this book, no doubt the next thing that happens is going to be really awkward and surprising. And it's not going to be shaped, or it's not going to perform for me the way that I thought it did when I was still living. So that was one of my kind of tropes, was let's make sure that whatever this Bardo is, it's got a, like morphologically, and I wanted it to be shaped really strangely. So the logic is different in some places than others maybe, or different for different people. So it's not at all, strictly speaking, a Tibetan Bardo.
You just made reference to, while you were writing this book, you were working on this book for a long time, 13 years?
Well, depending how you define it. Yeah, I heard the story that was the inciting thing way back in the Bill Clinton years, just an offhanded remark by my wife's cousin that Lincoln had, gone into the crypt and interacted with his dead son's body. And I just kind of kept kicking it down the road all those years. I had a feeling I couldn't do it, mainly just because it seemed like something that was going to have to be approached pretty earnestly.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't sure that I had the chops to do that. So I just kind of kept going, yeah, that's a good one. And and then right before 10th of December came out, I kind of had this little talk with myself, just like, dude, you're 50, whatever I was.
You sat yourself down?
I sat myself down, talked to myself, bought myself a drink. And I, just like, this is something that you've been wanting to write your whole life. You've now been through many of the major milestones of life. I'm old. I have beautiful kids, or everything. Why is this material too earnest for you, or too something? So I made a little contract with myself that I kind of do 3 months of trying it just to see if it caught fire. And but because I kind of want to be that person who, on the deathbed or whatever said, well, I had a nice writing career, but I just got a little scared, and I decided it would be safer to just keep doing what I was doing. So it was one of those kind of things. So that was a nice kind of a, midlife leap or something like that.
Let's go back to that original historical story of Lincoln visiting his 11-year-old son Willie's corpse in the crypt. It's so haunting. What happened?
Well, I mean, the sad thing, as a parent will feel this, the Lincolns had arranged this party that they were going to have, and it was kind of understood to be a way to save some money. And I think also they were a little bit under the gun for throwing a party during wartime. So they came up with this idea of having kind of a different kind of a party, and there was a lot of planning. They're having it, and just before, the day before, the two boys, Willie and Tad, got sick, high fever.
Mm-hmm.
So they put them to bed, and they kind of conferred, and a doctor said, well, they'll probably be fine. Just go ahead and have the party. So they had this party, the Marine Band, big thing. Lincoln and Mary are running back and forth from the party to the boys' sick room. And then just so happens, Willie took a turn for the worse that night, or shortly thereafter, and that the illness had killed him. So there was some talk in the media about how irresponsible it was, and I'm sure they internalized that as a bad decision they'd made.
This was in February 1862.
Yeah. And so then he passed away, and it was kind of one of the many low moments of the war. So it was kind of not exactly an uplifting idea, but apparently he was, this is his favorite kid and the one that he saw the most of himself in. And so newspapers at the time reported that he had gone back and actually gone into the crypt. And the thing that intrigued me was it said on several occasions. So I kept thinking, okay, I can kind of see the first time, especially in that culture. But anybody, when you lose somebody, we like to say they're not there anymore, and yet they kind of are. It's the same body, it's the same. So I understood that, but then I was thinking, well, what would stop him? Let's say he went there twice. What would stop him the third time? Now, some of the answers are obvious, but you kind of wonder what's the progression that one goes through to be so kind of lovably off kilter to go into the crypt. What happens that corrects that? I think originally I thought it would be on 3 successive nights, but that didn't feel, as I tried to do it, it didn't feel right. So it was one night. So that makes it even more interesting to me. Like, you go in there at 11. How do you get out of the graveyard?
Do any accounts exist of Lincoln himself talking about those repeated visits to Willie's crypt?
No, none. And that was one of the other intriguing things was that I don't actually know how anyone would know that he did that. He certainly didn't speak about it. He could have been observed going. We really just don't know. And in a sense, that was the perfect kind of seed, because there were so many things that weren't known about it. It could have just been some reporter making it up. I kind of don't think so. It's a weird thing to make up.
Yeah.
But we just don't know. So then you think, well, what time of day was it? I assume night. Who saw it? And that gives you just enough wiggle room to kind of imagine how it might have, or maybe should have happened.
So you knew you wanted to write about this, and the challenge for you was the material was so earnest. Did you know that you wanted it to be a novel as opposed to a short story?
No. Over the many years of failing to write novels, or writing novels and having them shrink into pamphlets or, disintegrate altogether, I kind of learned that the best stance for me is to actually try not to write a novel. Just don't extend, don't dwell, don't bloat. Just try to make everything short as I can. So I think originally I had tried it as a play for a few years, and you can sort of see the traces of that in this book. But there's not a single line, I don't think, from the play. It's funny, when I was writing in play mode, it's like when I try to write a poem, it gets this kind of schmaltzy, weird performed quality that doesn't really work. So at one point I was talking to Deborah Treisman at the New Yorker, and I was telling her about this failed play, and she just said, well, why don't you write it as a novel? And in retrospect, it seemed like, yeah, but something about her saying it and using the word novel and thinking, oh yeah, I could write it the way I write prose, it just kind of threw a switch. And then at the same time, one of my former students, Adam Levin, said, just kind of offhandedly, that he thought if I ever wrote a novel, it would be a series of monologues, like I had done in this story called Four Institutional Monologues from McSweeney. Oh, and also I've been reading. I hadn't read Infinite Jest until a few years ago, and reading that, it occurred to me that that's a book of monologues, actually, when you really look at it. So, sometimes for me, the artistic seed, it's kind of multi-tracked. There's several different things that happen at once, or roughly at once, that kind of just throw a switch in your head. So I thought, okay, I don't really want to write a novel, but I want to finally take this material on and discharge it. And I kind of felt like if I could do it, I would learn something really valuable in the process. And for me, that's really the best reason you write a book, is to push your inner artistic ball down the field a little bit.
So there were multiple challenges then. It was the earnest factor and the novel thing, and presumably just the daunting idea of writing about Lincoln in some way, such a towering figure who has been the subject of previous books.
Oh boy, yeah. Try to write a novel about Jesus,
Right.
like that. Yeah.
Go. So that's a lot to take on in your first novel.
Yeah, well, and I guess for me, the way you take those things on is you sort of accept those problems, and this is very new age, but you accept those problems as opportunities. For example, one of the first problems I came into contact with was, okay, it's in my imagination, it's night. Lincoln sort of sneaks out of the White House. Then suddenly you're like, okay, who's narrating this thing?
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to write a long book from Lincoln's point of view? I didn't personally, and not for any theoretical reason, but when I turn my sort of writing mind to that, I just go, ugh. Instead of ooh, I go, ugh. And that's, for me, that's a deal breaker. If the inner Labrador doesn't rise to the voice opportunity, I know better than to start. And then you think, well, maybe it's a grave digger,
Mm-hmm.
somebody who stayed a little too late that night, but why in the world is he,
Right.
it's a grave, unless he really likes what he does or something. I don't know, but that didn't work. So then these other ideas, the idea of the kind of monologue in the chorus came into play. And then weirdly, and I have not been able to sequence this correctly as I'm talking about this book, but way back when, I tried an earlier novel that was also a graveyard novel. And the premise of that one was that all these dead people in an upstate New York graveyard, and whenever someone was to die, they would sort of give a roast, or they would do a life review. So I had about 80 pages of that way back in the 90s, and it was all right, but it didn't go anywhere. It was just kind of a bunch of monologues. But there were just maybe 6 or 7 pages in there where something had happened with the back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
They were set up similar to this book, kind of inspired by chat lines, and that, especially in the 90s when chat lines first started, and you'd ask a question and the answer would show up 3 pages later, and it was all kind of discombobulated. But there were a few pages of that abandoned novel that really were cool, the way they looked on the page, the way that the ghosts were talking past each other and insulting one another. And so I didn't really save any of the text, I don't think, but I saved the feeling of the velocity of certain parts of the text. So at one, I don't remember the order, but at some point I thought, oh yeah, who would observe in a graveyard? Oh yeah, the ghosts. And I sort of had that structural model from like 15 years before. So who knows? It's kind of a blur, actually.
You mentioned the form of the novel earlier as sort of at first was a play, and then you end up structuring it with this in a kind of as a kind of oral history. I think Colson Whitehead, in his review of the book, calls it a collage of testimonies. Did that form come naturally? Did you go back and forth between a traditional narrative and till you arrived at this, or how did that evolve?
I think, as I remember, I think what happened was I had sort of decided to do the ghost that way with a kind of a monologue and then an attribution afterwards. Or maybe at that point it was the attribution came first. I think that's what I did for a while. And then there was this, we talk about problems or opportunities. Then a new problem arrived, which is that, and this is a holdover problem from the 90s novel. With that many ghosts, the reader starts to feel a little jerked around because the ghost is recognized as being in the same family as the dream sequence. So the writer can just write whatever he wants, and because there's no physical constraints on it, it the sky's the limit. And I think a reader reading too many of those ghosts in that old book would feel like, all right, I'm at your disposal. You don't seem constrained by any kind of reality. So in this book, that factor, and then the second one, which is that by the time I wrote this, I'd been thinking about it for a long time, and I had a lot of this stuff almost like novelized in my mind. That party scene, and I had a lot of it already imagined and reimagined. And when I just had the ghost, there was no way for all that historical stuff to come in.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point for a couple weeks, I'm like, I need some kind of historical spine here, just to make, if the reader starts to go, I don't believe these ghosts, or I don't want to read a book all about ghosts, I want to give her something else, some kind of like a steady wall to lean against while her belief refills in a certain way. So I thought, well, how do I know about all this historical stuff? And I thought, well, I just read it, and that kind of light went on. Like, oh yeah, could you just sample that stuff? Don't even just eliminate the middleman. No third person narration of the things. Just drop them in. And I kind of like flinched at that a little bit. Like, well, that's not writing. That's typing. But then I tried it for a while. I would type all these sections out and cut them up with scissors and get on the floor of my room and rearrange them. And the weird thing was, some of them were better than others. As we know from editing, you can take a piece and cut it and move stuff, and suddenly there's life in it. So then it was kind of I got a little sneaky kind of ornery voice in my head, like, well, you're a curator. You're sampling that stuff, and from the beginning, from the way beginning, my thing was, if I'm going to do this, I don't want to write a satire on Lincoln. That's a very beautiful human moment. I don't want to dishonor. And I had, as I was writing, I had a picture of Willie and a picture of Lincoln up above the side of my desk, just to remind me that don't get too lost in the literary stuff. Remember that these are a real father and son, and that was a real loss. So all of this stuff was kind of it came out of what it felt like necessity, maybe an urge to not do it the normal way, because somehow I don't like that. But ultimately, it was just to try to serve that emotional core of that, the father and the son.
So it's an experimental novel. It's a historical novel. It's a father-son story. It's a book about Lincoln. There's a Tibetan Buddhist element. You threw in a little new age thing. Very ambitious. Do you think you'll do?
And there's gunfighters
and action.
Yeah.
Will your next book be a novel, do you think? Or are you going?
I really honestly don't know. I'm kind of going back to that same old artistic principle, which is to see if it goes or
right,
and just wait and see. My first impulse would be to go back to writing stories, because that's what I love, and I've always done that. And again, this one I only let it off the leash because it insisted.
All right. Well, a pleasure talking to you. Hopefully, we'll talk about the next book. George, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
For our second conversation, there's not really a news peg. It's just an author and a book that I really love. In March 2019, Pamela spoke with Patrick Radden Keefe for the release of his book Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland. This book combines the tale of Jean McConville, a mother of 10 who disappeared in 1972 from her home in Belfast, with a history of the Troubles, the decades-long conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. I've recommended this book to countless people over the past 3 years, and I'm recommending it to you now. Read it, or at the least listen to our conversation with Keefe.
Patrick, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you became interested in this story in one of my personal favorite ways for authors to become interested in stories. It happens more often than one might think. Tell us about how you first became interested in the subject of your book.
Well, it was on the obituary page of the New York Times. In 2013, I stumbled across an obituary, and it was one of those obituaries that just cracks open a whole world that you had very little kind of inkling of beforehand. A woman named Dolores Price had died, and she had been an IRA soldier. She joined the IRA in Northern Ireland in the early 1970s, and she'd lived a very dramatic life. And I was so intrigued by her story and some of the little details in this obituary that I wanted to see where it went.
Like, what was it that got you?
Well, it was a few things. So she had been the first woman to join the IRA as a real frontline soldier, kind of leading bombing raids and targeting people for execution and things like that. And she had come from a very traditional kind of IRA family and grew up indoctrinated in this sense that if you were Irish, you had a duty to expel the British from Ireland by any means necessary. And she was just kind of a very dramatic, impetuous figure who had taken part in some very famous operations and had gone to prison and gone on hunger strike and kind of faced down Margaret Thatcher and married a movie star, and then later in life became quite disaffected. And one of the details in this obituary was that it mentioned a famous case, a case I had not known about, but a case that was very famous in Ireland, of a woman named Jean McConville who was murdered in 1972, a mother of 10. And the connection between these two women, which was right there in that obituary, struck me as really interesting and a way to possibly tell a larger story.
All right. Well, you don't start with that connection at the beginning of your book. That's revealed later on.
Yeah, well, that was deliberate. I mean, as I pushed into this case of this woman, Jean McConville, who was a widow and a mother of 10 and had been abducted in front of her children and disappeared. She was secretly buried, so the children never knew what had happened to her. I realized that it pulled together the lives of a handful of people, not just Dolores Price, but both victims and perpetrators. And so I thought that might be a kind of frame through which to tell this story and look at the impact of that one act of violence on these different people. So in the book, in terms of the storytelling, I didn't want to reveal that right away at all. And I think
I was going to say to people, don't read the obituary first if you want
right,
to
please
read the book,
don't.
because
Yes.
it really unfolds like a mystery, and you're very deliberate with your construction of the narrative.
Yeah, and I mean, look, there's a vast literature of books on the Troubles, and I've read a great many of them at this point, but I find a lot of that literature a little bit forbidding. And so part of what I was trying to do was tell this very much as a narrative and approach it the way you would approach a novel rather than a history book, in the sense that there are big events in the history of the Troubles that hardly rate at all in my book because they didn't affect the handful of characters that I chose to be writing about. So I really only wanted to see this story through the points of view of this half a dozen or so people.
Well, the novelistic quality of the book is something that reviewers have pointed out in terms of the characterization, the pacing, and also this central mystery. So let's start with that, with Jean McConville. What happened to her?
So one winter night in late 1972, she was at home in West Belfast in a big, vast housing project where she lived, and she had 10 kids. Her husband had died earlier that year. And one evening there was a knock at the door and a gang of masked people burst inside, and they had guns, and they dragged her out in front of her kids, and they told the kids, "We just want to take her away for a few hours. We want to talk to her, but we'll bring her back." And she left, and the kids never saw her again. And we know now that it was the IRA that took her away and ended up killing her and burying her in an unmarked grave. But her children didn't know. So initially they stayed in the apartment thinking that they had to be there because she'd eventually come back.
Was there anything in her life up to that point that indicated that she might be an obvious target for the IRA?
It depends on who you ask. So what the IRA eventually said about this case, which again, Jean McConville's not a household name here, but in Ireland, this is one of the most iconic victims of the Troubles, was that she had been an informer for the British Army. And her family really strenuously denies that. There are people who are really convinced of both sides. If you look at her life, though, I mean, what her children say is she had 10 kids. She was recently widowed. She was taking pills. She tried to commit suicide. She was in and out of a psychiatric hospital. She was not a master spy. The contention of the IRA is that she had been observing goings-on in this housing project where she lived, which happened to be a stronghold of the IRA, and passing that information along to the British Army for money.
So there are a number of characters in the book, but obviously there are these two central figures, Dolores Price and Jean McConville, both of them dead when you start writing. How did you go about bringing them to life? Because they're so vivid in the book.
Thank you. I mean, it was slow going. I should say, I mean, in my day job at The New Yorker, I think probably about half the pieces I do are what we call write-arounds, where you don't have access to the central figure. And so over the years, I've devised a fair number of, I mean, tricks isn't really the right word, but
do reveal all your tricks.
Techniques, let's say. So in the beginning of the book, there's a sequence in which Dolores Price and her sister, when they're teenagers, go on a protest, kind of peaceful protest march, actually inspired by the March on Selma. In 1969, they marched from Belfast to Derry to protest civil rights injustices for Catholics in Northern Ireland. And the march gets ambushed. So Dolores Price is dead, and there were a few times in her life when she referred to what happened to her on this march. And so I started with those. And then it's a question of, well, who else was on the march and have they written about it? And so I find their recollections. And then what contemporary newspaper accounts were there? Were there reporters along for the march? So I get those. Were there photographers there? Was there archival footage? I get those. Were there other people who were on that march who are still alive who remember Dolores Price and can tell me about the experience? I get those. And eventually what I did was I went to the place where the ambush happened. I didn't, it was a 60-mile march, so I didn't walk the whole thing. But I did go to the scene where this kind of climactic ambush towards the end happens. And with all of those different pieces of source information, I'm able to stitch together something that hopefully the surface of it feels quite smooth when you're reading it, but it's cobbled together from very disparate sources.
Jean McConville had 10 children. Are they all still alive, and did you talk to all of them?
I didn't talk to all of them, no, and a number of them have died. I spent a lot of time talking with 3 of them, and one in particular, Michael McConville, who is featured somewhat more than some of the others in the book. Her children, as you'd imagine, have had experiences of just unbelievable trauma. Watching their mother taken away, and then what happened was that the government came in and said, no, we have to put you in an orphanage. And the kids said, okay, well, at least let us stay together. Let us all be together. And the government split them up. And they ended up in these awful kind of predatory orphanages in Northern Ireland, and some of them were abused physically and sexually. So this is a family that to this day has had to contend with just a huge amount of trauma. That made these conversations intense and difficult, but I've tried to tell their story with as much fidelity and respect as I can. And I should say, in the book, you find out what happened to Jean McConville. I reveal quite precisely the circumstances of her death and what went into that. And in doing that, I'm drafting on an incredibly brave effort by her children, starting in the 1990s, to come out and break the code of silence in Ireland and say, we need to know what happened to our mother. We've been waiting decades for answers, for a body. And I think it took great courage for them to do that.
There's also this other great body of evidence, the Belfast Project. Can you tell us about that?
There was this big controversy brewing, which is that Dolores Price had taken part in a secret oral history project at Boston College in which former combatants from the Troubles talked about all of the different things they'd done. And this was a kind of a risky bid by people affiliated with Boston College to put together a kind of first-person history of the Troubles in which paramilitaries discuss the murders they committed, the bombings, the war crimes they took part in. And that ended up being a kind of secret resource, and the idea was that it would only be unsealed when the participants were dead. But it didn't work out that way. And part of what Say Nothing is about is the kind of spectacular fashion in which that all unraveled, in which the authorities in Northern Ireland learned that there was this secret archive of reminiscences by ex-terrorists across an ocean in Boston.
It's almost amazing that it happened in the first place. How do they justify that? How do they find the people to talk to, get them to talk? And what's the legality around that it would then not be revealed? Because not all of these crimes that they described had necessarily been punished, right?
Very few of them had been. And this was part of what fascinated me about this story, is that there had been this real culture of silence in Northern Ireland throughout the Troubles. Then in 1998, you get this peace deal, and there was a fair degree of euphoria and a sense that, there's a new future and things are going to work out. And it was during that period that this project was hatched. But at the time, they knew that there was something radioactive about these reminiscences. And so as a result, they kept the project very, very secret. So all of these interviews were done in secret. When the interviews were finished, they would hand carry them back to Boston. People were communicating on encrypted email. There was a real sense that you couldn't have people find out about this. But I think I think we see this kind of thing play out in other areas in life too. If you have too small a group of people who know about something, there's not always the tendency to kind of troubleshoot and kick the tires in the way that you should. And so they never lawyered it as carefully as perhaps they should have. So they were essentially making guarantees to these people. You can give us these recordings in which you talk about these things you've done, and we guarantee you that it won't come out until you're dead. But that, it turns out, legally was a guarantee that they couldn't make. And indeed, part of what happens at the end of the book is we learn that some of these recordings end up in the hands of the police in Northern Ireland.
Are they still otherwise closed off? You can't simply, as a researcher, go and access and listen to them?
No, I mean, it's this awful irony, right? So the intention at the beginning was, if you think about any post-conflict situation, there's truth, there's reconciliation, there's accountability, there's all these kind of competing imperatives that you have when you look back in a situation like the Troubles at a scenario in which 3,600 people are killed and many more wounded, and how do we deal with that? The intention of what they called the Belfast Project, this secret archive at Boston College, was that this wasn't about accountability. This was about truth. We want to create a record that scholars and journalists can pore over in the future in order to just tell people, here's what happened. Here's what happened to these victims. Here's who took part. Here's why they did it. And it's not about helping the police bring people to trial and face justice. The outcome has ended up being almost exactly the opposite of that, which is that journalists and scholars are never going to have access now to this archive.
Why?
Because it became essentially a kind of political weapon. The police in Northern Ireland ended up subpoenaing the archive. And the authorities in the U.S., including federal judges, said that a lot of these recordings had to be turned over. And now the police are using them to investigate people. So at this stage, it's very difficult for anybody to actually get access, anybody like me who wants to write a book or an article to get access to these. But the cops and prosecutors can.
This is your third book. You wrote a book, Chatter, about the world of global eavesdropping, a book about the Chinatown underworld called The Snakehead. And you've just announced another book coming on the Sacklers, which is the subject of a piece you did for The New Yorker in 2017. How do you sort of decide, okay, this is more than just a story for the magazine. This is something that I want to spend, say, 3 or 4 years going into?
I'm still figuring it out, to be honest with you. My first book was different, Chatter, but The Snakehead started as a piece in The New Yorker, and Say Nothing did as well. And I think it's that moment when you get to the end of a piece, and it can be quite a long piece. So the piece that I published in The New Yorker in 2015 about Dolores Price and Jean McConville, that was a 15,000-word article. But I had this very profound sense as I got to the end that there were things I didn't know that I wanted to, and that there were stories that I thought I would have liked to tell, even in 15,000 words, there wasn't room for. So I think it's a combination of things. For me, are the characters compelling enough that I want to spend more time with them and would hope that a reader would? Are the narrative bones good enough that they can sustain the story over hundreds of pages? And then is the material there? So with the Sacklers, I wrote this piece about 18 months ago for The New Yorker about this family that is widely known as a big philanthropic family, but it turns out that most of their fortune comes from OxyContin, and in some ways they could be said to have helped kind of spark the opioid crisis. The question came up after the piece came out whether or not there was a book there, and at the time I didn't think there was because the characters were fascinating, the story seemed urgent and important, but I just wasn't sure that I could get into the black box of what was happening within the Sackler family and their relationship with the company. But as it happened, the Attorney General of Massachusetts took an interest in this case and in the Sacklers in particular, and she has subpoena power, which I don't. And she proceeded to subpoena 1 million documents from the company.
You've got your work cut out for you.
I do.
Wow. Well, we've managed to talk without revealing any of the central sort of mysteries and reveals in this book. So I will go against my own interest as a New York Times journalist. Tell people, do not read the obituary until you read the book. The book, again, is Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Redden Keefe. Patrick, thank you so much again.
That was our interview with George Saunders from 2017 and Patrick Redden Keefe from 2019. We'll have more from the Book Review Podcast Archive next week. I'm Gilbert Cruz. Thank you for listening.